Alan sat very quietly in the empty apartment that had once belonged to Max Hawkes and stared at nothing in particular. It was 5 hours since the abortive robbery. He was alone. The news had been blared out over every form of communication there was. He knew the story by heart. A daring robbery had been attempted, but police detection methods had yielded advance warning, and the robbers had been frustrated. The robo-guards had been specially equipped ones which could shift to an alternate wavelength in case of emergency. They had blanked out only momentarily, and special guards had been posted within the bank, ready to charge out. Byng and Hawkes had tried to block the doorway, and they had been shot down. Hawkes was killed instantly. Byng died an hour later in the hospital. At least 2 other members of the gang had been apprehended, Jensen and Smith, both trapped by the robo-guards. It was known that at least 2 other men, and possibly more, had participated in the attempt, and these were being traced now. Alan was not worried. He had not been within 100 feet of the crime, and it had been easy for him to slip away unnoticed. The others had had little difficulty either. Weber, Hollis, Kovac, Maguire, and Freeman. There was a chance that Hollis or Kovac had been recognized. In that case, they could be tracked down by televector. But Alan was not registered on the televector screens, and there was no other way of linking him with the crime. He glanced around the apartment at Hawkes' bar and his audio system and all the dead man's other things. Yesterday, Alan thought, Hawkes had been here, alive, eyes sparkling as he outlined the plans for the robbery a final time. Now he was dead. It was hard to believe that such a many-sided person could have been snuffed out so soon, so quickly. A thought occurred. The police would be investigating the disposition of Hawkes' property. They would want to know the relationship between Hawkes and Alan, and perhaps there would be questions asked about the robbery. Alan decided to forestall that. He reached for the phone. He would call security, tell them he had been living with Hawkes and had heard of the gambler's sudden, violent death, and in all innocence ask for details. He would... The door announcer chimed. Alan whirled and put down the receiver. Reaching out, he flicked on the door screen and was shown a view of a distinguished-looking, middle-aged man in the silver-gray uniform of the police. So soon, Alan thought. I didn't even get a chance to call. Who is it? He asked in a surprisingly even voice. Inspector Gaynor of Global Security. Alan opened the door. Inspector Gaynor smiled warmly, walked in, took the seat Alan offered him. Alan felt tense and jumpy and hoped not too much of it showed. The security man said, Your name is Alan Donnell, isn't it? And you're a free status man? Unregistered, employed as a professional gamesman, Class B. Alan nodded. That's right, sir. Gaynor checked a notation on a pad he carried. I suppose you've heard that the man who lived here, Max Hawkes, was killed in an attempted robbery this morning? Yes, sir. I heard it a little while ago on the newscasts. I'm still a little shaken up. Would you care for a drink, Inspector? Not on duty, thanks, Gaynor said cheerfully. Tell me, Alan, how long did you know Max Hawkes? Since last May. I'm an ex-Starman. I jumped ship. Max found me wandering around the city and took me in. But I never knew anything about any robberies, Inspector. Max kept his mouth pretty well sealed most of the time. When he left here this morning, he said he was going to the bank to make a deposit. I never thought... He stopped, wondering whether he sounded convincing. At that moment, a long jail sentence, or worse, seemed inevitable. And the worst part of it was that he had not wanted to take part in the robbery, indeed, had not taken part. But in the eyes of the law, he was undoubtedly as guilty as any of the others. Gaynor raised one hand. Don't misunderstand, son. I'm not here as a criminal investigator. We don't suspect you had any part in the attempt. Then why... He drew an envelope from his breast pocket and unfolded the papers it contained. "I knew Max pretty well," he said. "About a week ago he came to see me and gave me a sealed envelope, which was to be opened only in the event of his death on this particular day, and to be destroyed unopened otherwise. I opened it a few hours ago. I think you ought to read it." With trembling fingers, Alan took the sheaf of papers and scanned them. They were neatly typed. Alan recognized the blocky purple characters of the voice-write Hawkes kept in his room. He started to read. The document explained that Hawkes was planning a bank robbery to take place on Friday, October 3rd, 3876. He named none of his accomplices. He went on to state that one Alan Donnell, an unregistered ex-Starman, was living with him, and that this Alan Donnell had no knowledge whatsoever of the intended bank robbery. Furthermore, Hawkes added, in the event of my death in the intended robbery, Alan Donnell is to be sole heir and assign of my worldly goods. This supersedes and replaces any and all wills and testaments I may have made at any past time. Appended was a schedule of the properties Hawkes was leaving behind. Accounts in various savings banks totaled some 750,000 credits. Besides that, there were scattered investments, real estate holdings, bonds. The total estate, Hawkes estimated, was worth slightly over 1,000,000 credits. When Alan finished, he looked up, startled and white-faced, at the older man. "All of this is mine?" "You're a pretty rich young man," Gaynor agreed. "Of course, there are formalities. The will has to be probated and contested, and you can expect it to be contested by somebody. If you still have the full estate when the court gets through with you, you'll be all right." Alan shook his head uncomprehendingly. The way he wrote this, it's as if he knew. "Max Hawkes always knew," Gaynor said gently. "He was the best hunchman I've ever seen. It was almost as if he could look a couple of days into the future all the time. Sure, he knew, and he also knew it was safe to leave this document with me, that he could trust me not to open it. Imagine announcing a week ahead of time that you're going to rob a bank and then turning the announcement over sealed to a police officer." Alan started. The police had known about the robbery in advance. That was how Max and the dream duster Bing had been killed. Had Gaynor been the one who had betrayed them? Had he opened the sealed envelope ahead of time and sent Max to his death? No, it was inconceivable that this soft-spoken man would have done such a thing. Alan banished the thought. Max knew he was... this is Alan. Max knew he was going to be killed, he said, and yet he went ahead with it. Why? Maybe he wanted to die, Gaynor suggested. Maybe he was bored with life, bored with always winning, bored with things as they were. The man was never born who could figure out Max Hawkes anyway. You must have found that out yourself. Gaynor rose. I'll have to be moving along now, but let me give you some suggestions first. Sir? Go downtown and get yourself registered in free status. Have them give you a televector number. You're going to be an important person when you get all that money. And be very careful about who your friends are. Max could take care of himself. You may not be so lucky, son. Is there going to be an investigation of the robbery? Alan asked. It's underway already. You may be called down for questioning, but don't let it worry you. I turned a copy of Max's will over to them today, and that exonerates you completely. It was strangely empty in the apartment that night. Alan wished Gaynor had stayed longer. He walked through the dark rooms, half expecting Max to come home. But Max wasn't coming home. Alan realized he had been tremendously fond of Hawkes. He had never really shown it. He had never demonstrated much warmth toward the gambler, especially in the final days when they both lived under the pressure of the planned robbery. But Alan knew he owed much to Hawkes, rogue and rascal though he was. Hawkes had been basically a good man, gifted, too gifted perhaps, whose drives and passions led him beyond the bounds of society. And at 35, he was dead, having known in advance that his last day was at hand. The next few days were busy ones. Alan was called to security headquarters for questioning, but he insisted he knew nothing about the robbery or Hawke's friends, and the document Hawkes had left seemed to bear him out. He was cleared of all complicity in the robbery. "What's up there, Goldie? How you doing? Long time no see." He next went to the central directory matrix and registered in free status. He was given a televector transmitter. It was surgically embedded in the fleshy part of his thigh, and he accepted a drink from fat old Heinz McIntosh in remembrance of Hawkes. He spoke briefly with McIntosh about the process of collecting on Hawkes' estate, and learned it was a complex process, but nothing to be frightened of. The will was being sent through channels now. He met Hollis in the street several days later. The bloated loansman looked pale and harried. He had lost weight, and his skin hung flabbily over his bones now. Little as Alan liked the loansman, he insisted on taking him to a local restaurant for lunch. "How come you're still hanging around York City?" Alan asked. "I thought the heat was on for any of Max's old buddies." "Oh, it is," Hollis said, wiping sweat from his white, shiny forehead. "But so far I'm in the clear. There won't be much of an investigation. They killed 2 and caught 2, and that'll keep them happy. After all, the robbery was a failure." "Any notion why it failed?" Hollis nodded. "Sure, I have a notion. It was Kovac who tipped them off." "Mike? But he looked okay to me." "And to everybody. But he owed Bryson a lot, and Bryson was anxious to dispose of Max, so Kovac turned the plans of the robbery over to Bryson's boys in exchange for a quitclaim on the money he owed, and Bryson just forwarded it all on to the police. They were waiting for us when we showed up." That cleared Gaynor, Alan thought, in some relief. "How did you find this all out?" "Bryson himself told me." "What?" "I guess he didn't know exactly who besides Max was in on the deal. Anyway, he certainly didn't know I was part of the group," Hollis said. "Old man Bryson was laying off some bets with me, and he let something slip about how he tipped the police to Max. Then he told me the whole thing." "And Kovac?" "Dead," Hollis said bluntly. "Bryson must have figured out that if he'd sell Max out, he'd sell anybody out, so Kovac got taken care of. He was found yesterday. Heart failure, the report said. Bryson has some good drugs. Say, kid, any word yet on what's going to happen to all Max's dough?" Alan thought a moment before replying. "I haven't heard a thing. I guess the government inherits it." "Oh, that would be too bad," Hollis said speculatively. "Max was well loaded. I'd like to get my hands into some of that dough myself. So would Bryson and his bunch, I bet." Alan said nothing. When he was through eating, he paid the check and they left. Hollis heading north, Alan south. In 3 days, Hawke's will would go through the courts. Alan wondered if Bryson, who seemed to be York City's major criminal syndic man, would try some angle to get a share of Max's money. A Bryson man did show up at the hearing, a slick-looking operator named Berwin. His claim was that Hawkes had been affiliated with Bryson a number of years ago, and that Hawkes' money should revert to Bryson by virtue of an obscure law of the last century involving the estates of professional gamblers killed in criminal actions. The robocomputer, who was in charge of the hearing, pondered the request a few moments. Then relays clicked and the left-hand panel on the computer face lit up with a bright red "Application Denied" signal. Berwin spoke for 3 minutes, ending up with a request that the robocomputer disqualify itself from the hearing and allow itself to be replaced by a human judge. The computer's decision was even quicker this time. Application denied. Berwin tossed Alan's side of the court a black look and yielded ground. Alan had engaged a lawyer recommended once by Hawkes, a man named Jesperson. Briefly and concisely, Jesperson cited Alan's claim to the money, read the terms of the will, and stepped back. The computer considered Jesperson's plea for a few moments, reviewing the brief which the lawyer had taped and fed to the computer earlier. Time passed. Then the green panel lit and the words, "Application granted." Alan smiled. Bryson had been defeated. Max's money was his. Money that could be turned toward intensified research on the hyperdrive. "Well, son," Jesperson asked, "how does it feel to be a millionaire?" Man, boy, the things are really going fast right now. Yeah, so Goldie's been just been busy. Yeah. Nothing wrong with that. Actually, I'm not sure if I've did you know about the move to Twitch from Mixer? I'm not sure. I had to get a different name on Twitch because some weasel stole Carrington TV. So we're Play Carrington on Twitch there, Goldie. Just in case you are not aware. But yeah, book club, the Monday through Thursday book club, we moved that off of Twitch. Onto YouTube, because I think it's going to do a little better here in the long term. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Chapter 16. Just gonna have a little drink of water here. Oh, where'd it go? Oh, there it is. Boy. Found it down here. Still a little drink of this. Man, doing all this live. Very good. Chapter 16. At the time, he had been much too excited and flustered to answer anything. But as the next 12 months went by, he learned that being a millionaire was quite pleasant indeed. There were headaches, of course. There was the initial headache of signing his name several hundred times in the course of the transfer of Hawkes' wealth to him. There were also the frequent visits from the tax collectors, and the payment to them of a sum that staggered Alan to think about, in the name of rotation tax. But even after taxes, legal fees, and other expenses, Alan found he owned better than 900,000 credits, and the estate grew by investment every day. The court appointed a legal guardian for him, the lawyer Jesperson, who was to administer Alan's money until Alan reached the biological age of 21. The decision was an involved one, since Alan had undeniably been born 300 years earlier, in 3576, but the robo-judge that presided over that particular hearing cited a precedent 700 years old, which stated that for legal purposes a Starman's biological and not his chronological age was to be accepted. The guardianship posed no problems for Alan, though. When he met with Jesperson to discuss future plans, the lawyer told him, "You can handle yourself, Alan. I'll give you free rein with the estate, with the proviso that I have veto power over any of your expenditures until your 21st birthday." Well, that sounded fair enough. Alan had reason to trust the lawyer. Hadn't Hawkes recommended him? I'll agree to that," Alan said. "Suppose we start right now. I'd like to take a year and travel around the world. As my legal guardian, you'll be stuck with the job of managing my estate and handling investments for me." Jesperson chuckled. You'll be twice as wealthy when you get back. Nothing makes money so fast as money." Alan left the first week in December, having spent 3 weeks doing virtually nothing but sketching out his itinerary. There were plenty of places he intended to visit. There was London, where James Hudson Cavour had lived and where his hyperdrive research had been carried out. There was the Lexman Institute of Space Travel in Zurich, where an extensive library of space literature had been accumulated. It was possible that hidden away in their files was some stray notebook of Cavour's, some clue that would give Alan a lead. He wanted to visit the area in Siberia that Cavour had used as his testing ground, and from which the last bulletin had come from the scientist before his unexplained disappearance. But it was not only a business trip. Alan had lived nearly half a year in the squalor of Hasbrook, and because of his free status he would never be able to move into a better district, despite his wealth. But he wanted to see the rest of Earth. He wanted to travel just for the sake of travel. Before he left, he visited a rare book dealer in York City and for an exorbitant 50 credits purchased a 5th edition copy of An Investigation into the Possibility of Faster-than-Light Space Travel by James H. Cavour. He had left his copy of the work aboard the Valhalla, along with the few personal possessions he had managed to accumulate during his life as a starman. The book dealer had frowned when Alan asked for the volume under the title he knew, The Cavour Theory. "I don't think... wait." He vanished for perhaps 5 minutes and returned with an old, fragile, almost impossibly delicate-looking book. Alan took it and scanned the opening page. There were the words he had read so many times. "The present system of interstellar travel is so grossly inefficient as to be virtually inoperable on an absolute level." "Yes, that's the book. I'll take it." His first stop on his round-the-globe jaunt was London, where Cavour had been born and educated more than 13 centuries before. The Stratoliner made the trip across the Atlantic in a little less than 3 hours. It took half an hour more by overshoot from the airport to the heart of London. Somehow, from Cavour's few autobiographical notes, Alan had pictured London as a musty old town, picturesque, reeking of medieval history. He couldn't have been more wrong. Sleek towers of plastic and concrete greeted him. Overshoots roared by the tops of the buildings. A busy network of bridges connected them. He went in search of Cavour's old home in Bayswater, with the nebulous idea of finding some important document wedged in the woodwork. But a local security officer shook his head as Alan asked for directions. "Oh, sorry, lad, never heard of that street. Why don't you try the information robot up there?" The information robot was a blocky, green-skinned synthetic planted in a kiosk in the middle of a broad, well-paved street. Alan approached and gave the robot Cavour's 13-century-old address. "There is no record of any such address in the current files," the steely voice informed him. "No, it's an old address. It dates back to at least 2570. A man named Cavour lived there." The robot digested the new data. Relays hummed softly within it as it scanned its memory banks. Finally, it grunted. "Data on the address you seek has been reached." Fine. Where's the house?" "The entire district was demolished during the general rebuilding of London in 2982 to 2997. Nothing remains." "Oh," Alan said. The London trail trickled out right then and there. He pursued it a little further, managed to find Cavour's name inscribed on the honour roll of the impressive London Technological Institute for the year 2529, and discovered a copy of Cavour's book in the Institute library. There was nothing else to be found. After a month in London, Alan moved on eastward across Europe. Most of it was little like the descriptions he had read in the Valhalla's library. The trouble was that the starship's visits to Earth were always at least a decade behind, usually more. Most of the library books he had come backing up a paragraph. Most of it was little like the descriptions he had read in the Valhalla's library. The trouble was that the starship's visits to Earth were always at least a decade behind, usually more. Most of the library books had come aboard when the ship had been first commissioned, far back in the year 2731. The face of Europe had almost totally altered since then. Now, shiny new buildings replaced the ancient houses which had endured for as much as 1,000 years. A gleaming bridge linked Dover and Calais. Elsewhere, the rivers of Europe were bridged frequently, providing easy access between the many states of the Federation of Europe. Here, there, monuments of the past remained. The Eiffel Tower, absurdly dwarfed by the vast buildings around it, still reared its spidery self in Paris, and Notre Dame still remained as well. But the rest of Paris, the ancient city Alan had read so much of, that had long since been But the rest of Paris, the ancient city Alan had read so much of, that had long since been swept under by the advancing centuries. Buildings did not endure forever. In Zurich, he visited the Lexman Institute for Space Travel, a magnificent group of buildings erected on the royalties from the Lexman space drive. A radiant statue, 60 feet high, was the monument to Alexander Lexman, who in 2337 had first put the stars within the reach of man. Alan succeeded in getting an interview with the current head of the institute. Excuse me. Good gracious. Wow. Don't know where that came from. Okay. Man, okay. Let's, start that one again. Actually, let's back up a paragraph. Stop there, Anya. Good morning, Anya. Thank you. Thank you for that. Oh boy. Hope your Thursday's going great. Hope I'm not coming down with a cold. That would suck. In Zurich, he visited the Lexman Institute for Space Travel, a magnificent group of buildings erected on the royalties from the Lexman space drive. A radiant statue, 60 feet high, was the monument to Alexander Lexman, who in 2337 had first put the stars within the reach of man. Alan succeeded in getting an interview with the current head of the institute, but it was anything but a satisfactory meeting. It was held in an office ringed with mementos of the epoch-making test flight of 2338. "I'm interested in the work of James H. Cavor," Alan said almost immediately, and from the bleak expression that appeared on the scientist's face, he knew he had made a grave mistake. "Cavour is as far from Lexman as possible, my friend. Cavour was a dreamer, Lexman a doer." Well, Lexman succeeded, but how do you know Cavour didn't succeed as well? "Because, my young friend, faster-than-light travel is flatly impossible. A dream, a delusion." You mean that there's no faster-than-light research being carried on here? "The terms of our charter, set down by Alexander Lexman himself, specify that we are to work toward improvements in the technique of space travel. It said nothing about fantasies and daydreams. No, hyperdrive research is taking place. Hyperdrive research is taking place at this institute, and none will take place so long as we remain true to the spirit of Alexander Lexman." Alan felt like crying out that Lexman was a bold and daring pioneer, never afraid to take a chance, never worried about expense or public reaction. It was obvious, though, that the people of the Institute had long since fossilized in their patterns. It was a waste of breath to argue with them. Discouraged, he moved on, pausing in Vienna to hear the opera. Max had always intended to spend a vacation with him in Vienna, listening to Mozart, and Alan felt he owed it to Hawks to pay his respects. The operas he saw were ancient, medieval in fact, better than 2,000 years old. He enjoyed the tinkly melodies, but found some of the plots hard to understand. He saw a circus in Ankara, a football game in Budapest, a null-grav wrestling match in Moscow. He journeyed to the far reaches of Siberia, where Cavour had spent his final years, and found that what had been a bleak wasteland, suitable for spaceship experiments in 2570, was now a thriving modern city of 5 million people. The site of Cavour's camp had long since been swallowed up. Alan's faith in the enduring nature of human endeavor was restored somewhat by his visit to Egypt, for there he saw the pyramids, nearly 7,000 years old. They looked as permanent as the stars. The first anniversary of his leaving the Valhalla found him in South Africa. From there he traveled eastward through China and Japan, across the highly industrialized islands of the far Pacific, and from the Philippines he returned to the American mainland by jet express. He spent the next 4 months traveling widely through the United States, gaping at the Grand Canyon and the other scenic preserves of the West. East of the Mississippi, life was different. There was barely a stretch of open territory between York City and Chicago. It was late in November when he returned to York City. Jesperson greeted him at the airfield, and they rode home together. Alan had been gone a year. He was past 18 now, a little heavier, a little stronger. Very little of the wide-eyed boy who had stepped off the Valhalla the year before remained intact. He had changed inwardly. But one part of him had not changed, except in the direction of greater determination. That was the part that hoped to unlock the secret of faster-than-light travel. He was discouraged. His journey had revealed the harsh fact that nowhere on Earth was research into hyperspace travel being carried on. Either they had tried and abandoned it as hopeless, or like the Zurich people, they had condemned the concept from the start. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Jesperson asked. Alan slowly shook his head. "Not a hint, and I really covered ground." He stared at the lawyer a moment. "How much am I worth now?" "Well, offhand," Jesperson thought for a moment, "say $1,300,000. I've made some good investments this past year." Alan nodded. "Good. Keep the money piling up. I may decide to open a research lab of my own, and will need every credit we've got." But the next day an item arrived in the morning mail which very much altered the character of Alan's plans for the future. It was a small but thick package, neatly wrapped, which bore as return address the name Dwight Bentley, with a London number. Alan frowned for a moment, trying to place the name. Then it came back to him. Bentley was the vice provost of the London Institute of Technology, Cavour's old school. Alan had had a long talk with Bentley one afternoon in January about Cavour, about space travel, and about Alan's hopes for developing a hyperspace drive. The parcel was the right size and thickness to contain a book. Alan slit the fastenings and folded back the outer wrapper. A note from Bentley lay on top. London, 3rd November, 3877. My dear Mr. Donnell, perhaps you may remember the very enjoyable chat you and I had one day at this institute last winter on the occasion of your visit to London. You were, I recall, deeply interested in the life and work of James H. Cavour, and anxious to carry on the developments he had achieved in the field of space travel. Several days ago, in the course of an extensive resurveying of the Institute's archives, the enclosed volume was discovered, very thoroughly hidden in the dusty recesses of our library. Evidently, Mr. Cavour had forwarded the book to us from his laboratory in Asia, and it had somehow become misfiled. I am taking the liberty of forwarding the book on to you in the hopes that it will aid you in your work, and perhaps ultimately bring you success. Would you be kind enough to return the book to me, care of this institute, when you are finished with it? Cordially, Dwight Bentley. Alan let the note slip to the floor as he reached for the enclosed book. It was leather-bound and even more fragile than the copy of The Cavour Theory he had purchased. It looked ready to crumble at a hostile breath. With mounting excitement, he lifted the ancient cover and turned it over. The first page of the book was blank, so were the second and third. On the fourth page, Alan saw a few lines of writing in an austere, rigid hand. He peered close, and with awe and astonishment read the words written there. The Journal of James Hudson Cavour, Volume 16, Jan 8 to October 11, 2570. Alrighty. Yeah, so, boy, okay, so this book is really, like, it's starting to hop around all over the place now. Yeah, boy, oh boy. So, there was that little bit at the beginning of the book there, that little foreword by Robert Silverberg there, where he talks about like this being one of his very, very, very early books. I think it was his second one, I think he said. He was 19 when he wrote this. And he's like, yeah, I've come a long way since writing this, but yeah, it's fun. It's fun, but it's definitely just like bouncing around. Alrighty. So far, so good. We're all with it, right? For those who might have just joined us, we're reading part 4 of Starman's Quest by Robert Silverberg. It's a fairly short book, and actually, we will be finishing it today. Yeah, we're currently at 85% of the way in. All right, just taking another little sip of water. Man, the studio gets a little warm. Alrighty, let's continue. Let's get on with it. Time is a-wasting. Chapter 17. The old man's diary was a curious and fascinating document. Alan never tired of poring over it, trying to conjure up a mental image of the queer, plucky fanatic who had labored so desperately to bring the stars close to Earth. Like many embittered recluses, Cavour had been an enthusiastic diarist. Everything that took place in his daily life was carefully noted down. His digestion, the weather, any stray thoughts that came to him, tart observations on humanity in general. But Alan was chiefly interested in the notations that dealt with his researches on the problem of a faster-than-the-speed-of-light space drive. Cavour had worked for years in London, harried by reporters and mocked by scientists. But late in 2569 he had sensed he was on the threshold of success. In his diary for January 8, 2517, he wrote, "The Siberian site is almost perfect. It has cost me nearly what remains of my savings to build it, but out here I will have the solitude I need so much. I estimate 6 months more will see completion of my pilot model. It is a source of deep bitterness in me that I am forced to work on my ship like a common laborer, when my part should have ceased 3 years ago, with the development of my theory and the designing of my ship. But this is the way the world wants it, and so shall it be." On May 8 of that year. Today there was a visitor, a journalist, no doubt. I drove him away before he could disturb me, but I fear he and others will be back. Even in the bleak Siberian steppes I shall have no privacy. Work is moving along smoothly, though somewhat behind schedule. I shall be lucky to complete my ship before the end of the year. On August 17. Planes continue to circle my laboratory here. I suspect I am being spied on. The ship is nearing completion. It will be ready for standard Lexman drive flights any day now, but installation of my space warp generator will take several more months. On September 20. Interference has become intolerable. For the 5th day, an American journalist has attempted to interview me. My secret Siberian laboratory has apparently become a world tourist attraction. The final circuitry on the space warp generator is giving me extreme difficulties. There are so many things to perfect. I cannot work under these circumstances. I have virtually ceased all machine work this week." And on October 11, 2570, "There is only one recourse for me. I will have to leave Earth to complete the installation of my generator. The prying fools and mockers will not leave me alone, and nowhere on Earth can I have the needed solitude. I shall go to Venus, uninhabited, uninhabitable. Perhaps they will leave me alone for the month or two more I need to make my vessel suitable for interstellar drive. Then I can return to Earth, show them what I have done, offer to make a demonstration flight, to Rigel, and back in days, perhaps. Why is it that Earth so tortures its few of original mind? Why has my life been one unending persecution ever since I declared there was a way to shortcut through space? There are no answers. The answers lie deep within the dark recesses of the human collective soul, and no man may understand what takes place there. I am content to know that I shall have succeeded despite it all. Some day a future age may remember me, like Copernicus, like Galileo, as one who fought upstream successfully." The diary ended there, but in the final few pages were computations, a trial orbit to Venus, several columns of blast-off figures, statistics on geographical distribution of the Venusian land masses. Cavour had certainly been a peculiar bird, Alan thought. Probably half the persecutions he complained of had existed solely inside his own fevered brain, but that hardly mattered. He had gone to Venus. The diary that had found its way back to the London Institute of Technology testified to that. And there was only one logical step for Alan. Go to Venus. Follow the orbit Cavour had scribbled at the back of his diary. Perhaps he might find the Cavour ship itself. Perhaps the site of his laboratory, some notes, anything at all. He could not allow the trail to trickle out here. He told Jesperson, "I want to buy a small spaceship. I'm going to Venus." He looked at the lawyer expectantly and got ready to put up a stiff argument when Jesperson started to raise objections. But the big man only smiled. "Okay," he said. "When are you leaving?" "You aren't going to complain? The kind of ship I have in mind costs at least 200,000 credits. "Oh, I know that, but I've had a look at Cavour's diary, too. It was only a matter of time before you decided to follow the old duck to Venus, and I'm too smart to think that there's any point in putting up a battle. Let me know when you've got your ship picked out, and I'll sit down and write the check." But it was not as simple as that. Alan shopped for a ship. He wanted a new one, as long as he could afford it, and after several months of comparative shopping and getting advice from spaceport men, he picked the one he wanted. It was a sleek, glossy, 80-foot job, a Space Master 3878 model, equipped with Lexman converters and conventional ion jets for atmosphere flying. Smooth, streamlined, it was a lovely sight as it stood in the space field, in the shadow of the great starships. Alan looked at it with pride, a slender, dark green needle yearning to pierce the void. He wandered around the spaceport and heard the fuelers and oilers discussing it in reverent tones. "It's a mighty fine piece of ship, that green one out there. Some lucky fellow's got it." Alan wanted to go over to them and tell them, "That's my ship, me, Alan Donnell." But he knew they would only laugh. Tall boys, not quite 19, did not own late-model Space Masters with price tags of 225,000 credits. He itched to get off planet with it, but there were more delays. He needed a flight ticket first, and even though he had had the necessary grounding and astrogation technique and space piloting as an automatic part of his education aboard the Valhalla, he was rusty and needed a refresher course that took 6 weary months. After that came the physical exams and the mental checkup and everything else. Alan fumed at the delay, but he knew it was necessary. A spaceship, even a small private one, was a dangerous weapon in unskilled hands. An out-of-control spaceship that came crashing to Earth at high velocity could kill millions. The shockwave might flatten 50 square miles. so no one was allowed up in a spaceship of any kind without a flight ticket, and you had to work to win your ticket. It came through, finally, in June of 3879, a month after Alan's 20th birthday. By that time he had computed and recomputed his orbit to Venus 100 different times. 3 years had gone by since he last had been aboard a spaceship, and that had been the Valhalla. His childhood and adolescence now seemed like a hazy dream to him, far in the back of his mind. The Valhalla, with his father and Steve and all the friends of his youth aboard, was 3 years out from Earth, with 7 years yet to go before it reached Procyon, its destination. Of course, the crew had experienced only about 4 weeks, thanks to the Fitzgerald contraction. To the Valhalla people, only a month had passed since Alan had left them, while he had gone through 3 years. He had grown up in those 3 years. He knew where he was heading now, and nothing frightened him. He understood people, and he had one great goal which was coming closer and closer with each passing month. Blast-off day was the 5th of September, 3879. The orbit Alan finally settled on was a 6-day trip at low acceleration across the 40 million-odd miles that separated Earth from Venus. At the spaceport, he handed in his flight ticket for approval, placed a copy of his intended orbit on file with central routing registration, and got his field clearance. The ground crew had already been notified that Alan's ship was blasting off that day, and they were busy now putting her in final departure condition. There were some expressions of shock as Alan displayed his credentials to the ground chief and climbed upward in the control chamber of the ship he had named the James Hudson Cavour. But no one dared question him. His eyes caressed the gleaming furnishings of the control panel. He checked with the central tower, was told how long till his blast-off clearance, and rapidly surveyed the fuel meters, the steering jet response valves, the automatic pilot. He worked out a tape with his orbit on it. Now he inserted it into the receiving tray of the autopilot and tripped a lever. The tape slid into the computer, clicking softly and emitting a pleasant hum. 8 minutes to blast off, came the warning. Never had 8 minutes passed so slowly. Alan snapped on his view screen and looked down at the field. The ground crew men were busily clearing the area as blast-off time approached. 1 minute to blast off, Pilot Donnell. Then the countdown began, second by second. At the 10 seconds to go announcement, Alan activated the autopilot and nudged the button that transformed his seat into a protective acceleration cradle. His seat dropped down, and Alan found himself stretched out, swinging gently back and forth in the protecting hammock. The voice from the control tower droned out the remaining seconds. Tensely, Alan waited for the sharp blow of acceleration. Then the roaring came, and the ship jolted from side to side, struggled with gravity for a moment, and then sprang up free from the earth. Some time later came the sudden, thunderous silence as the jets cut out. There was the dizzying moment of free fall, followed by the sound of the lateral jets imparting longitudinal spin to the small ship. Artificial gravity took over. It had been a perfect takeoff. Now there was nothing to do but wait for Venus to draw near. The days trickled past. Alan experienced alternating moods of gloom and exultation. In the gloomy moods, he told himself that this trip to Venus was a fool's errand, that it would be just another dead end, that Cavour had been a paranoid madman, and that the hyperspace drive was an idiot's dream. But in the moments of joy, he pictured the finding of Cavour's ship, the building of a fleet of hyperdrive vessels, the distant stars within almost instantaneous reach. He would tour the galaxies as he had 2 years ago toured Earth. Canopus and Deneb, Rigel and Procyon. He would visit them all, from star to bright star, from one end of the universe to the other. The shining oval of Venus grew brighter and brighter. The cloud layer that enveloped Earth's sister planet swirled and twisted. Venus was virtually an unknown world. Earth's colonies had been established on Mars and on Pluto, but Venus, with her harsh formaldehyde atmosphere, had been ignored. Uninhabited, uninhabitable, the planet was unsuitable for colonization. The ship swung down into the cloud layer. Floating wisps of gray vapor streamed past the orbiting Cavour. Finally, Alan broke through, navigating now on manual, following as best he could Cavour's old computations. He guided the craft into a wide-ranging spiral orbit 3,000 feet above the surface of Venus and adjusted his view screens for fine pickup. "What's up there, Mr. Blanton? Good morning, good morning." He was orbiting over a vast dust-blown plain. The sky was a fantastic color, mottled blues and greens. "Oh, Death Tom's here." "Oh, no, it's Lady Death. It's Lady Death. Oh, boy. Okay, well, good morning. Good morning to you as well." All right. The sky was a fantastic color, mottled blues and greens, and an all-pervading pink, and the air was dull gray. No sun at all penetrated the heavy shroud of vapor that hung round the planet. For 5 hours he scouted the plain, hoping to find some sign of Cavour's habitation. It was hopeless, he told himself. In 1,300 years the bitter winds of Venus would have destroyed any hint of Cavour's site, assuming the old man had reached Venus successfully. But grimly, Alan continued to circle the area. Maybe Cavour had been forced to land elsewhere, he thought. Maybe he never got here. There were a million maybes. He computed his orbit and locked the ship in. Eyes pressed to the view screen, he peered downward, hoping against hope. This trip to Venus had been a wild gamble from the start. He wondered if Max Hawkes would have covered a bet on the success of his trip. Max had been infallible when it came to hunches. Well, Alan thought, now I've got a hunch. Help me one more time, Max, wherever you are. Lend me some of your luck. I need it, Max. He circled once more. The Venusian day would last for 3 weeks more. There was no fear of darkness, but would he find anything? What's that? He leaped to the controls, switched off the autopilot, and broke out of orbit, going back for a return look. Had there been just the faintest metallic glint below, as of a spaceship jutting up from the sand? Yes, there was a ship down there, and a cave of some sort. Alan felt strangely calm. With confident fingers he punched out a landing orbit and brought his ship down in the middle of the barren Venusian desert. Yes, he's getting around. He's getting around now. Moving very fast. Yeah. Oh. Man, I think everyone is enjoying a lazy Thursday today. Boy, I'm feeling a little tired myself, actually. I take a little nap after this. So good. Okay, but boy, oh boy. So yeah, he's hot on the trail of Cavour and his hyperspace drive right now. Tracked him all the way to Venus. I doubt he's still alive, though. He vanished 1,300 years ago. Pretty sure he's not going to be alive. But we'll find out. We'll find out in our next chapter. We're actually 90% of the way through right now. 90%, just in case anyone is wondering. Chapter 18. Alan brought the Cavour down less than a mile away from the scene of the wreckage. It was the best he could do, computing the landing by guesswork, and climbed into his spacesuit. He passed through the airlock and out into the wind-swept desert. He felt just a little light-headed. The gravity was only 0.8 of Earth norm, and besides that, the air in his spacesuit, being perpetually renewed by the Benjamin rebreathing generator strapped to his back, was just a shade too rich in oxygen. In the back of his mind, he realized he ought to adjust his oxygen flow, but before he brought himself to make the adjustment, the surplus took its effect. He began to hum, then to dance awkwardly over the sand. A moment later, he was singing a wild space ballad that he thought he had forgotten years before. After 10 feet, he tripped and went sprawling down in the sand. He lay there, trickling the violet sands through the gloves of his spacesuit, feeling very light-headed and very foolish all at the same time. Oh yeah, I don't think there's a lot of 19-year-olds who could, who could have put together a novel like that. It was the second one. It was the second book as well. But he was still sober enough to realize he was in danger. It was an effort to reach over his shoulder and move the oxygen gauge back a notch. After a moment, the flow leveled out, and he felt his head beginning to clear. He was marching through a fantastic Baroque desert. Venus was a riot of colors, all in a minor key. Muted greens and reds, an overbearing gray, a strange ghostly blue. The sky, or rather the cloud layer, dominated the atmosphere with its weird pinkness. It was a silent world. A dead world. In the distance, he saw the wreckage of the ship. Beyond it, the land began to rise, sloping imperceptibly up into a gentle hill, with bizarre, sculptured rock outcroppings here and there. He walked quickly. 15 minutes later, he reached the ship. It stood upright, or rather, its skeleton did. The ship had not crashed. It had simply rotted away, the metal of its hide eaten by the sand-laden winds over the course of centuries. Nothing remained but a bare framework. He circled the ship, then entered the cave 100 feet away. He snapped on his light beam. In the darkness he saw a huddled skeleton, far to the rear of the cave. A pile of corroded equipment, atmosphere generators, other tools now shapeless. Cavour had reached Venus safely, but he had never departed. To his astonishment, Alan found a sturdy volume lying under the pile of bones, a book wrapped in metal plates. Somehow it had withstood the passage of centuries, here in this quiet cave. Gently he unwrapped the book. The cover dropped off at his touch. He turned back the first 3 pages, which were blank. On the 4th, written in the now familiar crabbed hand, were the words, "The Journal of James Hudson Cavour, Volume 17, October 20, 2570. Yeah, it's Starman's Quest by Robert Silverberg there, Death Time. He had plenty of time during the 6-day return journey to read and reread Cavour's final words and to make photographic copies of the withered old pages. The trip to Venus had been easy for old Cavour. He had landed precisely on schedule and established housekeeping for himself in the cave. But as his diary detailed it, he felt strength ebbing away with each passing day. He was past 80, no age for a man to come alone to a strange planet. There remained just minor finishing to be done on his pioneering ship, but he did not have the strength to do the work. Climbing the catwalk of the ship, soldering, testing, now with his opportunity before him, he could not attain his goal. He made several feeble attempts to finish the job, and on the last of them fell from his crude rigging and fractured his hip. He had managed to crawl back inside the cave, but alone, with no one to tend him, he knew he had nothing to hope for. It was impossible for him to complete his ship. All his dreams were ended. His equations and his blueprints would die with him. In his last day, he came to a new realization. Nowhere had he left a complete record of the mechanics of his space warp generator, the key mechanism without which hyperspace drive was unattainable. So, racing against encroaching death, James Hudson Cavour turned to a new page in his diary, headed it in firm, forceful letters, "For those who follow after," and inked in a clear and concise explanation of his work. It was all there, Alan thought exultantly. The diagrams, the specifications, the equations. It would be possible to build the ship from Cavour's notes. The final page of the diary had evidently been Cavour's dying thoughts. In a handwriting increasingly ragged and untidy, Cavour had indited a paragraph forgiving the world for its scorn, hoping that someday mankind would indeed have easy access to the stars. The paragraph ended in mid-sentence. It was, thought Alan, a moving testament from a great human being. Yeah, it's kind of a bit of a bummer the way he went out. Yeah, you got Chick-fil-A and Chick-fil-A and story time. Man, I'm a little bit jelly. The days went by, and the green disk of Earth appeared in the view screen. Late on the 6th day, the Cavour sliced into Earth's atmosphere, and Alan threw it in the landing orbit he had computed that afternoon. The ship swung in great spirals around Earth, drawing ever closer and finally beginning to home in on the spaceport. Alan busied himself over the radio transmitter, getting landing clearance. He brought the ship down easily, checked out, and hurried to the nearest phone. He dialed Jesperson's number. The lawyer answered back. "Oh, when did you get back?" "Oh, just now," Alan said. "Just this minute." "Well, did you?" "Yes, I found it. Oddly enough, he was in no hurry to leave Earth now. He was in possession of Cavour's notes, but he wanted to do a perfect job of reproducing them, of converting the scribbled notations into a ship. To his great despair, he discovered, when he first examined the Cavour notebook in detail, that much of the math was beyond his depth. That was only a temporary obstacle, he thought. He hired mathematicians, he hired physicists, he hired engineers. Through it all he remained calm, impatient perhaps, but not overly so. The time had not yet come for him to leave Earth. All his striving would be dashed if he left too soon. The proud building rose 100 miles from New York, The proud building rose 100 miles from York City, the Hawks Memorial Laboratory. There the team of scientists Alan had gathered worked long and painstakingly, trying to reconstruct what old Cavour had written, experimenting, testing. Early in 3881, the first experimental Cavour generator was completed in the lab. Alan had been vacationing in Africa, but he was called back hurriedly by his lab director to supervise the testing. The generator was housed in a sturdy, windowless building far from the main labs. The forces being channeled were potent ones, and no chances were being taken. Alan himself threw the switch that first turned the space warp generator on, and the entire research team gathered by the closed-circuit video pickup to watch. The generator seemed to blur, to waver, to lose substance and become unreal. It vanished. It remained gone 15 seconds, while 100 researchers held their breaths. Then it returned. It shorted half the power lines in the county. But Alan was grinning as the auxiliary feeders turned the lights in the lab on again. "Okay," he yelled. "It's a start, isn't it? We got the generator to vanish, and that's the toughest part of the battle. Let's get going on model number 2. By the end of the year, model number 2 was complete, and the tests this time were held under more carefully controlled circumstances. Again, success was only partial, but again Alan was not disappointed. He had worked out his timetable well. Premature success might only make matters more difficult for him. 3882 went by, and 3883. He was in his early 20s now, a tall, powerful figure, widely known all over Earth. With Jesperson's shrewd aid, he had pyramided Max's original 1,000,000 credits into an imposing fortune, and much of it was being diverted to hyperspace research. But Alan Donnell was not the figure of scorn James Hudson Cavour had been. No one laughed at him when he said that by 3885 hyperspace travel would be reality. 3884 slipped past. Now the time was drawing near. Alan spent virtually all his hours at the research center, aiding in the successive tests. On March 11, 3885, the final test was accomplished satisfactorily. Alan's ship, the Cavour, had been completely remodeled to accommodate the new drive. Every test but one had been completed. The final test was that of actual performance. And here, despite the advice of his friends, Alan insisted that he would have to be the man who took the Cavour on her first journey to the stars. 9 years had passed, almost to the week, since a brash youngster named Alan Donnell had crossed the bridge from the Spaces Enclave and hesitantly entered the bewildering complexity of York City. 9 years. He was 26 now, no boy any more. He was the same age Steve had been when he had been dragged unconscious to the Valhalla and taken aboard. And the Valhalla was still bound on its long journey to Procyon. 9 years had passed, but yet another remained before the giant starship would touch down on a planet of Procyons. But the Fitzgerald contraction had telescoped those 9 years into just a few months for the people of the Valhalla. Steve Donnell was still 26, and now Alan had caught him. The contraction had evened out. They were twins again. And the Cavour was ready to make its leap into hyperspace. Yeah. Okay, well, I think we can all see what's going to be happening there. Yeah. Going to be catching up. Man, oh man. Fast-paced, pulpy sci-fi. Yeah, all right. I like it. I hope you do too. You know, I'm not sure which book we're going to be reading next week. I haven't decided on that yet. If anyone's got any suggestions, let me know. Here or on Twitter. Discord, I mean. Yeah. Can talk about it there. Alrighty, where are we at? About to start chapter 19. Yeah, we'll definitely be finishing this book today. We've still got 50 minutes of story time to go. Yeah. And we're at 93% of the way through this one. 93. Okay, let's do it. Chapter 19. It was not difficult for Alan to get the route of the Valhalla, which had been recorded at Central Routing Registration. Every starship was required by law to register a detailed route chart before leaving, and these charts were filed at the Central Bureau. The reason was simple. A starship with a crippled drive was a deadly object. In case a starship's drive conked out, it would keep drifting along toward its destination, utterly helpless to turn, maneuver, or control its motion. And if any planets or suns happened to lie in its direct path, the only way a ship could alter its trajectory was to cut speed completely, and with the drive dead there would be no way of picking it up again. The ship would continue to drift slowly out to the stars while its crew died of old age. So the routes were registered, and in the event of drive trouble it was thus possible for a rescue ship to locate the imperiled starship. Space is immense, and only with a carefully registered route could a ship be found. Starship routes were restricted information. But Alan had influence. He was easily able to persuade the routing registration people that his intentions were honorable, that he planned to overtake the Valhalla if they would only let him have the coordinates. A bit of minor legal jugglery was all that was needed to give him access to the data. It seemed there was an ancient regulation that said any member of a Whoop, that's my phone. It seemed there was an ancient regulation that said any member of a starship's crew was entitled by law to examine his ship's registered route if he wanted to. The rule was intended to apply to starmen who distrusted their captains and were fearful of being shipped off to some impossibly distant point. It said nothing at all about starmen who had been left behind and were planning to overtake their ships, but nothing prohibited Alan from getting the coordinates, and so they gave them to him. The Cavour was ready for departure. Alan elbowed his way through the crowd of curious onlookers and clambered into the redesigned control chamber. He paused a moment, running his fingers over the shiny instrument panel with its new dials, strange levers, unfamiliar instruments. Overdrive compensator, fuel transmuter, distortion guide, bender index. Strange new names, but Alan realized they would be part of the vocabulary. They would be part of the vocabulary of all future spacemen. He began to work with the new controls, plotting his coordinates with extreme care and checking them through 6 or 7 times. At last he was satisfied. He had computed a hyperdrive course that would loop him through space and bring him out in only a few days' time in the general vicinity of the Valhalla, which was buzzing serenely along at near the speed of light. That was practically a snail's pace compared with hyperdrive. The time for the test had come. He spoke briefly with his friends and assistants in the control tower, then he checked his figures through one last time and requested blast-off clearance. A moment later the countdown began, and he began setting up for departure. A tremor of anticipation shot through him as he prepared to blast off on the first hyperdrive voyage ever made. He was stepping out into the unknown, making the first use ever of a strange, perhaps dangerous, means of travel. The drive would loop him out of the space-time continuum into where? And back again. He hoped. He punched down the keys and sat back to wait for the automatic pilot to carry him out from Earth. Somewhere past the orbit of the moon, a gong told him that the Cavour drive was about to come into play. He held his breath. He felt a twisting sensation. He stared at the view screen. The stars had vanished. Earth, with all its memories of the last 9 years, was gone, taking with it Hawks, Jesperson, New York City, the enclaves, everything. He floated in a featureless, dull gray void, without stars, without worlds. So this is hyperspace, he thought. He felt tired, and he felt tense. He had reached hyperspace. That was half the struggle. It remained to see whether he would come out where he expected to come out, or whether he would come out at all. 4 days of boredom. 4 days of wishing that the time would come to leave hyperspace. And then the automatic pilot came to life. The Cavour generator thrummed and signaled that it had done its work and was shutting down. Alan held his breath. He felt the twisting sensation. The Cavour was leaving hyperdrive. Stars burst suddenly against the blackness of space. The view screen brightened. Alan shut his eyes a moment as he readjusted from the sight of the gray void to that of the starry reaches of normal space. He had returned, and below him, making its leisurely journey to Procyon, was the great golden-hulled bulk of the Valhalla, gleaming faintly in the black night of space. He reached for the controls of his ship radio. Minutes later he heard a familiar voice, that of Chip Collier, the Valhalla's chief signal officer. "The Starship Valhalla picking up. We read you. Who's calling, please?" Alan smiled. "This is Alan Donnell, Chip. How goes everything?" For a moment, nothing came through the phones but astonished sputtering. Finally, Collier said thickly, "Alan, what sort of gag is this? Where are you?" "Believe it or not, I'm hovering right above you in a small ship. Suppose you get my father on the wire and we can discuss how I'll go about boarding you." 15 minutes later, the Cavour was grappled securely to the skin of the Valhalla like a flea riding an elephant, and Alan was climbing in through the main airlock. It felt good to be aboard the big ship once again, after all these years. He shucked his spacesuit and stepped into the corridor. His father was standing there waiting for him. "Hello, Dad." Captain Donnell shook his head uncomprehendingly. "Alan, how did you... and you're so much older, too. The Cavour drive, Dad. I've had plenty of time to develop it. 9 good long years back on Earth. And for you, it's only a couple of months since you blasted off." Another figure appeared in the corridor. Steve. He looked good. The last few months aboard the Valhalla had done their work. The unhealthy fat he had been carrying was gone. His eyes were bright and clear, his shoulders square. It was like looking into a mirror to see him, Alan thought. It hadn't been this way for a long time. "Alan, how did you—" Quickly, Alan explained. "So I couldn't reverse time," he finished. "I couldn't make you as young as I was. So I took the opposite tack and made myself as old as you were." He looked at his father. "The universe is going to change now. Earth won't be so overcrowded, and it means the end of the Enclave system and the Fitzgerald contraction." "We'll have to convert the Valhalla to the new drive," Captain Donnell said. He looked still stunned by Alan's sudden appearance. "Otherwise, we'll never be able to meet the competition of the new ships. There will be new ships, won't there?" "Well, as soon as I return to Earth and tell them I've been successful, my men are ready to go into the immediate production of hyperspace vessels. The universe is going to be full of them, even before your ship reaches Procyon." He sensed now the full importance of what he had done. Now that there's practical transportation between stars, the galaxy will grow close together, as close as the solar system is now. Captain Donnell nodded. "And what are you planning to do, now that you've dug up the Cavour drive?" "Me?" Alan took a deep breath. "I've got my own ship, Dad, and out there are Rigel and Deneb and Fomalhaut and a lot of other places I want to see." He was speaking quietly, calmly, but with an undercurrent of inner excitement. He had dreamed of this day for 9 years. "I'm going to take a grand tour of the universe, Dad, everywhere. The hyperdrive can take me. But there's just one thing." What's that?" Steve and the captain said virtually in the same moment. "I've been practically alone for the last 9 years. I don't want to make this trip by myself. I'm looking for a companion, a fellow explorer." He stared squarely at Steve. A slow grin spread over his brother's face. "You devil," Steve said. "You have planned this too well. How could I possibly turn you down?" "Do you want to?" Alan asked. Steve chuckled. "Do you think I do?" Alan felt something twitching at his cuff. He looked down and saw a bluish-purple ball of fur sitting next to his shoe, studying him with a wry expression. "Rat." "Of course. Is there room for a third passenger on this jaunt of yours?" "Application accepted," Alan said. Warmth spread over him. The long quest was over. He was back among the people he loved, and the galaxy was opening wide before him. A sky full of bright stars, growing brighter and closer by the moment, was beckoning to him. He saw the crewmen coming from their posts now. The rumor had flitted rapidly around the ship, it seemed. They were all there, Art Candon and Dan Callagher and a gaping Judy Collier and Roger Bond and all the rest of them. "You won't be leaving right away, will you?" the captain asked. "You can stay with us a while, just to see if you remember the place." "Oh, of course I will, Dad. There's no hurry now, but I'll have to go back to Earth first and let them know I've succeeded, so they can start production, and then—" "Deneb first," Steve said. "From there out to Spica and Altair." Grinning, Alan said, "More worlds are waiting than we can see in 10 lifetimes, Steve. But we'll give it a good try. We'll get out there." A multitude of stars thronged the sky. He and Steve and Rat, together at last, plunging from star to star, going everywhere, seeing everything. The little craft grappled to the Valhalla would be the magic wand that put the universe in their hands. In this moment of happiness he frowned an instant, thinking of a lean, pleasantly ugly man who had befriended him and who had died 9 years ago. This had been Max Hawke's ambition, to see the stars. But Max had never had the chance. "We'll do it for you, Max, Steve and I." He looked at Steve. He and his brother had so much to talk about. They would have to get to know each other all over again, after the years that had gone by. "You know," Steve said, "when I woke up aboard the Valhalla and found out you'd shanghaied me, I was madder than a hornet. I wanted to break you apart, but you were too far away." "Well, you've got your chance now," Alan said. "Yeah, but now I don't want to," Steve laughed. Alan punched him good-naturedly. He felt good about life. He had found Steve again, and he had given the universe the faster-than-light drive. It didn't take much more than that to make a man happy. And now a new and longer quest was beginning for Alan and his brother. A quest that could have no end, a quest that would send them searching from world to world, out among the bright infinity of suns that lay waiting for them. Yeah. The end. The end. Boy, and you could, see some of these other sci-fi books available from Gnome Press back in like 1950, what was this, 1956, I think it was, written. Let's see, I wonder what edition, why is this, Well, yeah, with the Foundation books, they were a bit later than that. Very good. But anyway, that's the end of that. Man. Sit there, Alan Ben. As a twin, there's some creepiness to the ending here. You have to imagine the author did not know much about twins. Yeah, well, he was, yeah. I mean, I think he was the author here, Robert Silverberg. I think he was definitely making up a fair amount of stuff as he went along. As we mentioned before, he was 19 years old when he wrote this book. So it's like, yeah, he still had a lot to learn along the way. All righty. Your brother and you would kill each other if you were holed up on a ship? We had to spend significant time together? Man. How common are twins, by the way? And I know I don't really know. I know that I don't think that it's a common thing, and I know that identical twins are even rarer. Next, we need something nice and spooky for Halloween. Yeah, we usually do a special Halloween show, and Halloween this year is on a Saturday, so yeah, it's going to be a pretty good one. Wow. Okay, Alan is an identical twin. Wow. It's a struggle for individual identity. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, boy, I bet and at the same time, you're kind of like growing up with them, in the same household there. Yeah, boy, it definitely would be a very interesting family dynamic, that's for sure. Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah, but I think in this case, Robert Silverberg was going for that. I know you read it in like a lot of books, I guess. Yeah, and I don't know much about twins myself, but you read in books about like this kind of almost psychic bond. I guess that identical twins are supposed to have. Um, yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't know. All I know is what I've read. The crypt. Well, it was the crypt keeper. The crypt keeper. Yeah. I'm just thinking. Let's see. Last year, actually, we had a really cool. Who was it? Was I forgot the name of the author. Let us read their Chad Waller. Chad Waller sent us a story to read called Frank, which was really good, really good. We did that was on a Halloween show. Yeah, and I have actually I have a recording of that, both the live one and a one I did a bit later. Got both of those in the super secret section on Discord. But yeah, we will do something special for Halloween. Might do it on Twitch. Maybe do it on. Well, actually, this is on YouTube. It's only a Monday through Thursday show. So we'll probably do a special Halloween one on Twitch, or I don't know, or maybe here on YouTube. I don't know. Haven't decided yet. But there will be a very, very cool Halloween show. Gonna be a lot of fun. All right, we still have a half hour to go. We still got a half hour of story time to go. So let's continue working our way through this one here. The Men of Yarnith. The Men of Yarnith. From Lord Dunsany's Time in the Gods. Slowly working through it. The Men of Yarnith. The Men of Yarnith hold that nothing began until Yarnith Tsai uplifted his hand. Yarnith Tsai, they say, has the form of a man, but is greater and is a thing of rock. When he uplifted his hand, all the rocks that wandered beneath the dome, by which they call the sky, gathered together around Yarnith Tsai. Of the other worlds they say naught, but hold that the stars are the eyes of all the other gods that look on Yarnith Tsai, and laugh, for they are all greater than he, though they have gathered no worlds around them. Yet though they be greater than Yarnith Tsai, and though they laugh at him when they speak together beneath the dome, they all speak of Yarnith Tsai. Unheard is the speaking of the gods to all except the gods. But the Men of Yarnith tell of how their prophet Iraun, lying in the sand desert Azrakhan, heard once their speaking, and knew thereby how Yarnith Tsai departed from all the other gods, to clothe himself with rocks and make a world. Certain is it that every legend tells that at the end of the valley of Yodeth, where it becomes lost among black cliffs, there sits a figure colossal against a mountain whose form is the form of a man, with the right hand uplifted, but vaster than the hills. and in the book of secret things, which the prophets keep in the temple that stands in Yarnith, is writ the story of the gathering of the world, as Iran heard it, when the gods spake together, up in the stillness above Azrakhan. And all that may be read, and all that read this may learn how Yarnith Sai drew the mountains about him like a cloak, and piled the world below him. It is not set in writing for how many years Yarnith Sai sat clothed with rocks at the end of the valley of Yodeth, while there was naught in all the world save rocks and Yarnith Sai. But one day there came another god, running over the rocks across the world, and he ran as the clouds run upon days of storm, and as he sped towards Yodeth, Yarnith Sai, sitting against his mountain with right hand uplifted, cried out, "What dost thou, running across my world, and whither art thou going?" And the new god answered never a word, but sped onwards, and as he went to left of him and to right of him, there sprang up green things all over the rocks of the world of Yarnith Sai. So the new god ran round the world and made it green, saying, in the valley where Yarnith Sai sat, monstrous against his mountain, and certain lands wherein Credoa, the drought brown. Well, that's a weird paragraph. Okay. So the new god ran round the world and made it green, saying, in the valley where Yarnith Sai sat monstrous against his mountain, and certain lands wherein Credoa the drought browsed horribly at night. Further, the writing in the book tells of how there came yet another god, running speedily out of the east, as swiftly as the first, with his face set westward, and naught to stay his running, and how he stretched both arms outward beside him, and to left of him, and to right of him, as he ran, the whole world whitened. And Yarnith Sai called out, "What dost thou, running across my world?" And the new god answered, "I bring the snow for all the world, whiteness and resting and stillness." And he stilled the running of streams, and laid his hand even upon the head of Yarnith Sai, and muffled the noises of the world, till there was no sound in all lands but the running of the new god that brought the snow, as he sped across the plains. But the two new gods chased each other for ever round the world, and every year they passed again, running down the valleys and up the hills and away across the plains, before Yarnith Sai, whose hand uplifted had gathered the world about him. And furthermore, the very devout may read how all the animals came up the valley of Yodeth to the mountain whereon rested Yarnith Sai, saying, "Give us leave to live, to be lions, rhinoceroses, and rabbits, and to go about the world." And Yarnith Sai gave leave to the animals to be lions, rhinoceroses, and rabbits, and all the other kinds of beasts, and to go about the world. But when they had all gone, he gave leave to the bird to be a bird, and to go about the sky. And further, there came a man into that valley, who said, "Yarnith Sai, thou hast made animals into thy world. O Yarnith Sai, ordain that there be men." So Yarnith Sai made men. Then was there in the world of Yarnith, and two strange gods that brought the greenness and the growing, and the whiteness and the stilling, and animals and men. And the god of the greenness pursued the god of the whiteness, and the god of the whiteness pursued the god of the greenness, and men pursued animals, and animals pursued men. But Yarnith sat still against his mountain with his right hand uplifted. But the men of Yarnith say that when the arm of Yarnith shall cease to be uplifted, the world shall be flung behind him, as a man's cloak is flung away. And Yarnith, no longer clad with the world, shall go back into the emptiness, beneath the dome among the stars, as a diver seeking pearls goes down from the islands. It is writ in Yarnith's histories by scribes of old that there passed a year over the valley of Yarnith that bore not with it any rain. And the famine from the wastes beyond, finding that it was dry and pleasant in Yarnith, crept over the mountains and down their slopes, and sunned himself at the edge of Yarnith's fields. And men of Yarnith, laboring in the fields, found the famine as he nibbled at the corn and chased the cattle. And hastily they drew water from deep wells and cast it over the famine's dry grey fur and drove him back to the mountains. But the next day, when his fur was dry again, the famine returned and nibbled more of the corn and chased the cattle further, and again men drove him back. But again the famine returned, and there came a time when there was no more water in the wells to frighten the famine with, and he nibbled the corn till all of it was gone, and the cattle that he chased grew very, very lean. And the famine drew nearer, even to the houses of men, and trampled on their gardens at night, and ever came creeping nearer to their doors. At last the cattle were able to run no more, and one by one the famine took them by their throats and dragged them down, and at night he scratched in the ground, killing even the roots of things, and came and peered in at the doorways, and started back and peered in at the door again a little further, but yet was not bold enough to enter altogether, for fear that men should have water to throw over his dry grey fur. Then did the men of Yarnith pray to Yarnith, as he sat far off beyond the valley, praying to him night and day to call his famine back. But the famine sat and purred, and slew all the cattle, and dared at last to take men for his food. And the histories tell how he slew children first, and afterwards grew bolder, and tore down women, till at last he even sprang at the throats of men as they labored in the fields. Then said the men of Yarnith, "There must go one to take our prayers to the feet of Yarnith, for the world at evening utters many prayers, and it may be that Yarnith, as he hears all earth lamenting when the prayers at evening flutter to his feet, may have missed among so many the prayers of the men of Yarnith. But if one go and say to Yarnith, there is a little crease in the outer skirts of thy cloak that men call the valley of Yarnith, where the famine is a greater lord than Yarnith, it may be that he shall remember for an instant and call his famine back." Yet all men feared to go, seeing that they were but men, and Yarnith was lord of the whole earth, and the journey was far and rocky. But that night Hothrundath heard the famine whining outside his house and pawing at his door. Therefore it seemed to him more meet to wither before the glance of Yarnite's eye than that the whining of that famine should ever again fall upon his ears. So about the dawn Hothrundath crept away, fearing still to hear behind him the breathing of the famine, and set out upon his journey whither pointed the graves of men. For men in Yarnith are buried with their feet and faces turned toward Yarnite's eye, lest he might beckon to them in their night and call them to him. So all day long did Hothrundath follow the way of the graves. It is told that he even journeyed for 3 days and 3 nights with naught but the graves to guide him as they pointed towards Yarnite's eye, where all the world slopes upwards towards Yodeth, and the great black rocks that are nearest to Yarnite's eye lie gathered together by clans, till he came to the 2 great black pillars of Asdarinth, and saw the rocks beyond them piled in a dark valley, narrow and aloof, and knew that this was Yodeth. Then did he haste no more, but walked quietly up the valley, daring not to disturb the stillness. For he said, "Surely this is the stillness of Yarnite's eye, which lay about him, before he clothed himself with rocks." Here, among the rocks which first had gathered to the call of Yarnite's eye, Hothrundath felt a mighty fear, yet went onwards because of all his people, and because he knew that thrice in every hour, in some dark chamber, death and famine met to speak 2 words together: the end. But as dawn turned the darkness into grey, he came to the valley's end, and even touched the foot of Yarnite's eye, but saw him not, for he was all hidden in the mist. Then Hothrundath feared that he might not behold him to look him in the eyes when he sent up his prayer. But laying his forehead against the foot of Yarnite's eye, he prayed for the men of Yarnith, saying, "O Lord of famine and Father of death, there is a spot in the world that thou hast cast about thee, which men call Yarnith, and there men die before the time thou hast apportioned, passing out of Yarnith. Perchance the famine hath rebelled against thee, or death exceeds his powers. O Master of the world, drive out the famine as a moth out of thy cloak, lest the gods beyond that regard thee with their eyes, and say, There is Yarnite's eye, and lo, his cloak is tattered." And in the mist no sign made Yarnite's eye. Then did Hothrundath pray to Yarnite's eye to make some sign with his uplifted hand, that he might know he heard him. In the awe and silence he waited, until nigh the dawn the mist that hid the figure rolled upwards. Serene above the mountains he brooded over the world, silent with right hand uplifted. What Hothrundath saw there upon the face of Yarnite's eye no history telleth, or how he came again alive to Yarnith. But this is writ, that he fled, and none hath since beheld the face of Yarnite's eye. Some say that he saw a look on the face of the image that set a horror tingling through his soul, but it is held in Yarnith that he found the marks of instruments of carving about the figure's feet, and discerning thereby that Yarnite's eye was wrought by the hands of men, he fled down the valley, screaming, "There are no gods, and all the world is lost." And hope departed from him, and all the purposes of life. Motionless behind him, lit by the rising sun, sat the colossal figure, with right hand uplifted, that man had made in his own image. But the men of Yarnith tell how Hothrun-Dath came back again, panting to his own city, and told the people that there were no gods, and that Yarnith had no hope from Yarnithsai. Then the men of Yarnith, when they knew that the famine came not from the gods, arose and strove against him. They dug deep for wells, and slew goats for food, high up on Yarnith's mountains, and went afar, and gathered blades of grass, where yet it grew, that their cattle might live. Thus they fought the famine. For they said, If Yarnithsai be not a god, then is there nothing mightier in Yarnith than men. And who is the famine, that he should bare his teeth against the lords of Yarnith? And they said, If no help cometh from Yarnithsai, then is there no help but from our own strength and might. And we be Yarnith's gods, with the saving of Yarnith burning within us, or its doom, according to our desire. And some more the famine slew, but others raised their hands, saying, These be the hands of gods, and drave the famine back, till he went from the houses of men, and out among the cattle. And still the men of Yarnith pursued him, till above the heat of the fight came the million whispers of rain, heard faintly far off towards evening. Then the famine fled away, howling back to the mountains, and over the mountains' crests, and became no more than a thing that is told in Yarnith's legends. 1,000 years have passed across the graves of those that fell in Yarnith by the famine. But the men of Yarnith still pray to Yarnithsai, carved by men's hands in the likeness of a man. For they say, It may be that the prayers we offer to Yarnithsai may roll upwards from his image, as do the mists at dawn, and somewhere find at last the other gods, or that God, who sits behind the others of whom our prophets know not. All right, interesting. Interesting. All righty. Time and the Gods.